Okay, hey everybody. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Terrific to have all of you with us today for this Zoom event. Why is college teaching so hit or miss? And what can we do about it? I don't think it's any secret to anybody in the audience that America's colleges and universities feature some terrific, inspiring teaching and a whole lot of pretty mediocre, mind-bending teaching. And a common question for me in 35 years in and around universities and colleges is why the heck it is this way? Why is this just accepted? For instance, for those of us who spend much time in and around K-12 education, we know that while we have our real concerns about the quality of teaching in so many K-12 classrooms, this has been a fierce subject of debate and reform for decades. How come it's not in higher education? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And to talk about with us, we have maybe the three best people I could imagine to help us think about it, think about what the situation is and where we need to go. And the excuse for today, by the way, is a new book by one of our three panelists who's going to start us off. First up is going to be Jonathan Zimmerman. John's the Judy and Howard Berkowitz Professor in Education at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. John holds a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins. He is a decorated scholar who has written a number of influential historical books on education. You may well be familiar with his byline from his regular contributions to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and so forth. But today he's really going to be sharing with us some of the takeaways from his new book, The Amateur Hour, A History of College Teaching in America. The Amateur Hour is really the first serious look at why college teaching evolved the way it has and looks like it does. Then with us to help us turn John's historical insights into a more action-oriented conversation about, well, what do we do about all this? Are two folks who are busy spending their time trying to do something about it. First up will be Aimée Eubanks Davis. Aimée is the founder and CEO of Braven, which partners with universities to help low-income first-generation students transition from college to career. Aimée comes to this work after a long career in a series of senior executive roles at Teach for America. And if you're not familiar with Braven, you could think about it as Aimée's effort to take so much of what they've learned at Teach for America about how to provide great teaching to students who haven't gotten enough of it and help equip them for success going forward. We also have with us Jonathan Gyurko, president and co-founder of the Association of College and University Educators. Jonathan comes to his work at ACU after earning a PhD at Columbia University and teaching as an adjunct member at Columbia. He wound up spearheading the effective practice framework at the Association of College and University Educators, which was really an effort to reach out to lots of smart people who think about instruction and teaching and what classrooms do, and use that to partner with universities across the land to help them improve the quality of their teaching. Jonathan and Aimée are going to talk some about this work they're actually doing and how does it help us address some of the challenges that Jonathan's going to sketch out. Jonathan's going to set us off by talking for a little bit about his book. Then we're going to turn it over to Aimée and then Jonathan to give some context and color. Then we're going to have a conversation and then we're going to open it up to you. If you have questions that you'd like to share with us or reactions you'd like to hear the participants speak to, we'll be on Twitter at hashtag AEI College Teaching. That's hashtag AEI, capital C College, capital T Teaching. And you should feel free to hit us with any questions or reflections at that, right there. With that, we're going to launch off. We're going to wrap at 2 o'clock and hope we have an invigorating hour ahead of us. John, would you please take it away, my friend?
Thank you, Rick, and thanks to AEI for hosting all this and to my two distinguished co-panelists, and especially the Spencer Foundation, which gave me money to go to about 60 different archives around the country, which is what this book is based on. Now, if you don't get to the book, you can just wait for the film adaptation. But of course, they're never the same, book and movie, as we know. The book actually began in my own mind about 5-6 years ago when I was at a conference about a subject that is very much on our minds today, which is online instruction. And it was framed as a debate. And in the baldest terms, it was, as these debates often are, between the futurists and the Luddites. So the futurists said that online was going to make everything better. It was going to distribute education much more widely. It would be more easy to access, more easily tailored to people's backgrounds and interests. And the Luddites said, no, it was going to make everything worse. It was going to reinforce all kinds of different inequalities, make the actual pedagogy worse. And I realized at the end of the conversation that these two speakers had more in common than perhaps they acknowledged, which is they both thought they knew what the baseline was. So if you say everything is going to be better or everything is going to be worse, you must have some understanding of what everything is. But in fact, we don't. And I was quite shocked when I imagined this project to go and find that there were 10,000 histories of the American university and no single soup to nuts history of teaching at the university. So why not? Another little story which might help us give an answer is that when I was at NYU, my prior job, I received the university's Distinguished Teaching Award, which is a tremendous honor. It's the highest teaching honor the university gives. And there was a very nice dinner to celebrate the people that got the award. My mom and my dad, to whom the book is dedicated, were there. And I get up to the podium and my dean is going to introduce me. And I look at the lectern and on her notes are a list of books I've written, which we then proceeded to read in an award ceremony about teaching. So I wanted to know why that was. And let me just clarify one thing about the book's title without knowing what title the film will have. Already people have objected to the amateur hour because, of course, for many people, it implies that teaching is bad. Look, there are millions of people who teach at colleges. To say that teaching is anything is a ridiculous remark, right? You can't generalize. There's terrific teaching, there's terrible teaching, there are a million things in between. To say something that is amateur doesn't mean it's bad. The best gymnast of my youth was Olga Korbut, and she was an amateur because back then all Olympians were. What it means is that the activity is not professionalized, that there isn't a shared set of codes about what constitutes good practice, nor is there a system to try to evaluate and monitor whether people are adhering to that practice. So again, why not? Well, the story the book tells is a series of kind of contrapuntal critiques and reforms. People have been complaining about the poor quality of education for a very long time. So in the 1920s, when the university got suddenly very big, for two reasons, it was a time of wealth and American prosperity and women were starting to go. For the first time, you see students actively complaining about teaching because suddenly they're in rooms with 400 people and there's a guy, usually a guy in front, with a mic that isn't working and he's mumbling, they can't hear anything. And they start petitioning the university and also demanding student evaluations because they wanted a voice to explain and describe their own experience and to try to make teaching better. And what they demanded were a bunch of reforms, including tutorials, precepts, honor, the so-called honor systems, conferences, all these things designed to make teaching more intimate, more personal, less anonymous. Then in the 1950s, we see a similar dynamic, again, the dynamic being kind of complaint and efforts at reform. There, the huge boom is fueled, of course, by the GI Bill. Most Americans don't know this, but in 1947, half of undergrads were veterans. That's how dramatic the effect of the GI Bill was. And one of the things they did was they complained a lot about terrible teaching. these guys, and again, they were almost all guys, they're like, I was in Okinawa and I was at the Battle of the Bulge, and now I have to come back to this, where again, somebody jaws at me, I write down a couple things that I spit back on the test. So they start complaining. There's another round of student evaluations. And the reforms are twofold. First of all, groups like the Woodrow Wilson Foundation start trying to get so-called better people to go into teaching. There was this feeling that the Zimmermans of the world weren't good teachers because they had buried themselves in libraries and laboratories, and they were so-called dull dogs. And what we needed was people with some charisma, people with some personality. And that was the goal of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, to find them. At the same time, you see efforts to promote educational television, which interestingly was designed on the same principle. The idea was, if we find a really good personality, not Zimmerman, maybe Hess, we find that they've got a great personality, we'll put them on the screen and we'll televise them to everyone. Well, the students didn't necessarily agree. They found that medium highly impersonal, even though, again, it was supposed to create this sort of intimate, albeit electronic, connection between the student and the faculty. Then finally, in the 60s and 70s, the same dynamic. Growth, critique, reform. There, the growth is also spurred heavily by the federal government through the Higher Ed Act, which of course freed up federal money for grants and loans. And the Higher Ed Facilities Act, which fewer people talk about, but which had an enormous impact on the growth of American schools. Thanks to that act, there's a point in the late 60s where every day a new community college is opening up, which is just a crazy kind of growth that we can't even imagine. And what that meant was gigantic classes and a lot of complaints by students, again, about how rote, how anonymous, how impersonal these classes were. And so there the answers were, well, let's create smaller seminars, let's create tea groups, let's create encounter groups, let's create experimental universities like Evergreen, Old Westbury, University of California, Santa Cruz, all designed to kind of challenge this, what was called the mass class, the anonymity of these huge environments, and replace them with more intimate and personal ones. Now, why doesn't it work? I would say a couple things. I would say actually in some ways it has. Teaching has gotten better at the college level. And thanks to people like our panelists. Friends, I'll be honest, I didn't pay enough attention to present day reforms like our panelists are engineering, because I figured, to borrow from the economists, that my value added would be in the past. So I really end in the 1990s. But I do think the teaching has gotten better. I think we can document that. What we lack, though, again, is a system for actually changing teaching at the, well, systematic and cultural levels. We have a growing knowledge base about what constitutes good teaching. What we don't have yet are real systems for instituting it. And I would argue that, ironically, the main reason for that is precisely the fact that teaching is so personal. That makes it really hard to professionalize. So here's my book. And you should know that this book is not me, all right? I did write it. I spent a lot of time writing it, but I don't feel that it captures me. Some people will like it, other people won't. People will create critiques of it. And when I read those critiques, I won't take them personally. I really won't. Either it's a good critique and I'll think, gee, John, you should think more about that. Or it's kind of off base and I think the person didn't understand and I'll dismiss it. But in either case, I won't take it personally. If you come into my class and you tell me that I didn't teach well, am I going to take that personally? Let me think about this. Yes. Yes, I am. Why? Because my person is tied up in it. So how do you take an activity that is so personal, so relational, and actually create systems that will professionalize it without, God forbid, creating a new bureaucratic regime that requires all of us to fill out forms and hire more administrators, but doesn't actually make it better? So with that, I'll turn it over to others to enlighten me.
That's great. Thanks, John. Aimée, I mean, you've spent a lot of time and energy trying to help colleges do a better job of teaching and supporting and building skills for first generation low income students who maybe aren't getting what they're needing. Curious kind of what, as you read John's stuff and as you hear him speak,
Yeah.
how does that speak to you and what do you make of all this?
Yeah, well, the first part that speaks to me is that I'm a former sixth grade teacher. And so I go back in my mind to teaching sixth grade, social studies and language arts, and the amount of good pressure that I felt to make sure that students knew their grammar, how to diagram sentences, how to construct a strong paragraph, and more so because I knew it was so important to their lifelong learning and their ability to achieve academically over time. And honestly, because there were benchmarks that were in place in terms of where they needed to go in that year in English language arts that were also going to be measured as they were as individual students, but then I was as a teacher in terms of whether or not I had done a great job at teaching them what they needed to know when it came to the moment in which they were going to be measured. Whether that was a standardized test measurement or whether it was my own measurements or whether or not our school had different tools that they were using to show a student's growth, development, and mastery. And so as a mother now of 3 children who are still in the K-12 system, I'm obsessed with their teachers being excellent and high quality and doing what I was hoping to do and hopefully did for my former students. And I think, honestly, Rick, what happens is the moment young people leave K-12 and go into post-secondary, there is just this belief, I would say it's an illusion, that you no longer actually need to rely on strong, high-quality teaching because somehow there's some magic that happens when a young person turns into that new system that is just not as necessary because there aren't the same levels of benchmarks and I would argue transparency, accountability at that next level to see whether or not a young person is on track. And then really the question becomes, on track to what? And so in the world of Braven, it's, are you on track to coming out of college with a strong first job? Like, are you on track because we're working with first generation low income students? Like, are you going to get out of this institution with a job in which you earn the full dollar, not 66 cents on the dollar, but the full dollar, because you want to do that as a young person. Your family wants you to do this because they've invested all sorts of resources in terms of their time and their money. I mean, I would argue as a nation, we really need to make sure that we have a group of young people coming out of college who are really prepared to enter into the workforce so we can continue to be competitive. But I actually think it's that missing piece of the for what that happens in post-secondary, like why is it so important, that I think then allows for us as educators to maybe not be as uptight about whether or not students are truly learning what they need to learn. And so what we've done in the world of Braven is we've really partnered with colleges and universities, and I would argue some really, really innovative associate deans and faculty members who actually have said, it is true. Like, these students coming out and getting a strong job is just mandatory. And it's honestly, I look at it as whether or not I've been a great professor, a great faculty member, is whether or not that happens for them. And if it doesn't, then I feel like I'm not doing something right. We're not quite making sure that students get to that next goalpost. And that's what's been really inspiring to me. And what I've learned is actually it doesn't take that much to help our college faculty members actually take their teaching to a different level. So for example, there are some practices in K-12 that I think easily could shift into the world of higher education around the very simple things like I do. Let me first show you what you need to do in terms of learning how to communicate for the workforce because you don't know. And if you're coming from a family where you don't have professionals in your household, then there's no one to show and teach you that. So I think there's also an illusion around like who's in college now. I think it's changed dramatically. So the number of supports that young people really need it's just different. But then there's I do, then there's we do. So then let's all do it together, do a practice round. Let's make sure we all know what we're doing. And then it's you do. Like, okay, now it is time for you to go off and do this for yourself. And so in the world of Braven, what we've realized is in our partnerships with our colleges and universities is that we're really teaching students how to fish while we're also stocking the pond for them. But I just think that whole notion of really making sure that a student knows the why and the how somehow disappears almost between that transition moment. And I actually think it totally can come in without at all completely disrupting higher ed. I think you can evolve, but I actually think you don't need to completely disrupt the whole thing. I'm a liberal arts. I went to a liberal arts college. I found lots of benefits in learning about Shakespeare, but really it was really treacherous for me to not know how I was going to get a strong job afterwards in terms of the amount of time, money, resources, honestly, the debt that I was in. And so I think this is one of the more solvable problems that we're looking at.
That's great. Jonathan, you co-founded the Association of College and University Educators at a broad level, I think, to tackle some of the same kinds of concerns that Aimée just depicted. But my sense is that you actually go about the work quite differently. You have a different model, that you partner with colleges and universities in a different way to tackle some of the problems that John sketched. Can you talk a bit about how you guys are thinking about this work, and what are you learning along the way?
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me, and John, I love the book. Rick, you're right. Our mission is student success through quality instruction, and we do it by preparing and credentialing faculty in evidence-based teaching practices. And even before we go there, I think it's worth remembering that only 60% of first-time bachelor students will earn a degree in 6 years, and only 32% of community college students in 3, with figures that are even worse for low-income, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students. And it's not as if higher ed doesn't have a student success agenda. It does, and there's lots of great work happening, but many of those interventions are outside of the classroom. Or they address structural issues like program design, when we know that it's professors who spend more time with students than any other college professional, hundreds of hours. And plus, with the recent shift to online, classes are the one thing that has sustained. So our work gets to the heart of that matter, quality teaching and learning. But to do that, Rick, we had to address at least 4 of the major issues that John raised in his book. First question, what should every professor know and be able to do to teach well? Or as John described, what's the science alongside the legitimate art? And to answer that question, we did a deep dive into a 40-year literature, worked with experts, worked with faculty to define what you mentioned at the top of the call, our effective practice framework. 25 core competencies around course design, around how to establish a welcoming, inclusive environment, active learning, higher order thinking, and assessment in ways that promotes learning. Then the second design puzzle, the second question is, what kind of learning experiences for faculty would they find helpful, relevant, collegial, and lead to actual change in practice? And a lot of professional development happens outside of one's work, outside of class, in a workshop or a conference. So we took a different approach. We built scalable, modular online courses that address the competencies, that recommend hundreds of practices for both in-person and online teaching. Faculty take these courses together with a facilitator. They're asked to choose practices, implement week after week, and that learning design gives us real confidence and data about what faculty are learning and also what they're doing differently. I think the third big question was then, how do we nudge the incentives across higher ed so that faculty have more reason to invest time and energy in the development of their craft? And for that, we've collaborated with the American Council on Education, was thrilled to learn in John's book, ACE's long history with the issue of quality teaching, They reviewed and quality assured our courses. We co-issue with them a certificate in effective college instruction. And already we see that credential influencing hiring decisions, salary adjustments, and continuing education. Final question, and it's a shocker that we had to engage with it. Does good teaching make a difference? And it's something we had to answer to help institutions see that investment in their faculty, spending on the faculty side of the ledger, is actually a student success intervention. And so to date, we've published about 14 studies showing stronger achievement and closed equity gaps by students taught by the faculty with whom we've worked. Those studies are rigorous, comparison data, statistically significant findings. No surprise, good teaching matters. Grades go up, completion rates are higher, and we see comparable outcomes across race and class. So 6 years in now, we've worked with over 14,000 faculty members across 200 partner institutions, and no surprise, there's also extraordinary interest in our courses for effective online instruction and for more equitable instruction. But 14,000 is out of 1.5 million professors. We still have a long way to go. And that's my question to John and to the panel. You know, we've tried to be good students of history, to break some of the patterns you've identified, to create a real movement. Rick, treating this like a political problem. How do we build a coalition around this and around the importance of quality instruction? What else can we learn so that quality is as firm on the higher ed agenda as access and affordability? Thank you.
That's great. That's great, Jonathan. Thank you. John, so yeah, let me actually go back to you because, you know, as I hear Aimée and Jonathan talk about their efforts, you know, in reading your book, you say people have been thinking about this. It's not like a new idea that teaching ought to be better. The institutional explosion that you discuss in the 60s, these are community colleges are primarily teaching institutions. They weren't supposed to be research institutions. So look, I understand that like your fancy Dan UPenns that, you know, that employ folks like Zimmerman, why it might be research first, but help us understand, why is it that it's so unusual for campuses to support faculty instruction? Why does it feel like how good you are in a classroom is a nice thing rather than a core thing of a professor's being? Why is it that people getting their PhDs don't get training and coaching and how good they are in the classroom? Like, help us understand how we got here.
Rick, it's even worse than you're implying, because it isn't just that teaching would be a nice thing. One of the things that I document in my book is that good teaching has been held against people. Because if you could appeal to puerile 18-year-olds, what sort of serious scholar could you be? And there's this long and inglorious record of people getting awards like I got at NYU and it killing their careers. So why? It's tied up in what David Reisman, who's probably the most important person that ever wrote about higher ed, called the academic procession. And he wasn't talking about graduation. All right. The academic procession is everyone needs to become a research university. Why? That's where the status is. And Rick, that's where the dineros are. I mean, that's where it's at. Especially once the feds get in on this act and once research grants become, you know, such an important part of everybody's life. The way to get ahead is by making yourself into a research institution. So my first academic job was at Westchester University. It began as the Pennsylvania State Normal School. Then it became Westchester Teachers College, but that's not good enough, right? You got teacher in there. So now it's Westchester University. So everyone wants to be that. But the Teachers College thing is really important because an important inhibitor on what people like Jonathan and Aimée want is actually the negative status attached to education as a profession, as a discipline. And I know this one very well because, you know, I have a PhD in US history, but I've spent the bulk of my career at education schools and I've kind of straddled both zones. But at my last job, you know, somebody in the early stages just said to me, John, you do such good work. Why are you at the ed school? and that's sort of like saying, John, you're Jewish, but you're not cheap.
John, but one point here that I want to throw it to me and Jonathan to get to this. But we've seen this with pandemic pods this year, right? Teachers are suddenly being offered six figures in some affluent communities because families are in a market. Supposedly there's rewards for being good at what you do. This is a secret to the 7-figure South Korean, tutoring heads.
Yes.
How come in a market where we talk about higher ed as a marketplace, a lot of these institutions are selling undergraduate education? How come over the last half century, the fact that somebody was was an all-star, motivating, inspiring undergrad teacher wasn't regarded as a plus, wasn't regarded as a calling card?
Rick, I would say actually the answer to that is pretty simple. Students and their families haven't demanded it yet. I mean, one of the stories that my book tells is about the role of student protests, which has been significant and has led to important changes. It's just we don't have that protest now. I mean, you could argue in a way that the tuition demands, the demands for tuition cuts in the wake of the pandemic, in some ways represent an embryonic form of that, right? But I think that's pretty distinct to our moment and pretty particular. What you don't have is a widespread student movement to actually demand that this thing that Jonathan Gyurko was calling the student success movement be everything. I mean, just think about that term, a student success movement. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because we should all be in that enterprise. The idea that you have to have a special movement for that is crazy. Everyone has their favorite narcissistic moment in their own book. And mine comes at this thing I found in the archives in Colby College, one of those nice little places that is, Rick would tell you, was born in the teaching function and used to be called a teaching college. But in the 90s, they set up something called the Center for Teaching and Learning, which we all have now. And one of the older faculty, he's about to resign, he writes this memo in response to the proposal, and he says, a Center for Teaching and Learning, isn't that what Colby is? Or supposed to be? So the sad irony of the Centers for Teaching and Learning is they're trying to put an important emphasis on teaching, but the very need for them demonstrates how far we've moved away from that ideal. And until the students demand otherwise, despite the terrific efforts by our panelists and others, there won't be really substantive change.
Aimée, could you talk a little bit about what kind of reception you've received from institutions in reaching out? And I'm just real curious, how has it been similar or different to what you experienced in your years as an executive at Teach for America when you were working with K-12 systems on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, so what has been similar is that people are always a little bit nervous or skeptical of doing things a different way in education. I've seen that be the case in K-12, and that's for sure the case in higher ed. And John's book, I think, really does elevate this as just a problem around the profession itself. And again, I go back to, and to what end are we trying to get young people to? And so what I've seen actually at our university partners, which I've actually found in a very refreshing way to be pretty innovative, at least when it comes to incorporating the Braven model, because Braven is a course. So right there, that is a nod towards that young people being able to develop themselves while in college, including in liberal arts settings, towards the end of getting a job after, can actually be done. We can walk and chew gum, right? So it's a course. And what we first heard from the folks at San Jose State was that how the course functioned in terms of including the faculty members, because it's their course, but also including other people in from the workforce was just really innovative in a way that helped students. And so to John's point, I will say that what has been really refreshing is that we've met some faculty members and some deans who view themselves as not a student success strategy. They're like, this is my job. This is my job to make sure that these students come through my courses, come through this institution and get out strong, because it is a measure of whether or not we're worth the value. And to the point around students and student protests, I do sometimes wonder at our first university, San Jose State, they were coming out of some student protests around fees at the time. And what were the fees for? And I think the folks that we've been working with have been highly innovative, but I do think there was some really good student pressure going on about why are we spending this money? And I will say, in the middle of this pandemic that we're in, and as we're looking at an economy that we're not really sure where it's going to go on the back end, I do believe that this is a moment for students and their families to be putting more pressure on higher ed institutions to make sure that if they're going to spend all this time and money coming through them, that there is really a benefit on the back end. But that's what I've seen in both systems, is that there's always some skepticism, but there are always some good people in the system who really say we can do and want to do better, and it's finding them. And then the thing I wish could happen, that I'm not sure I think happens in K-12 either, is I really do wish there could be rewards for the folks who are doing strong teaching and honestly still publishing and still researching and still doing those other things. But actually there is a reward for being a professor or faculty member whose students go on to achieve great things post-college.
What do you have in mind, and how open have partner institutions been to that conversation?
Well, I have to say, we have not done anything in this world of award giving, though it has been something that has been going through our minds, because we have seen with certain institutions who we haven't partnered with yet, I'm going to say yet, that getting an award from Excellencia for your performance with Latinx students matters to a university. So I have to say, when I saw the news recently about the professor whose colleague went over to his house because he won the Nobel Prize, and he was like at his doorbell ringing, like, well, that's a big deal for a university. And so I really do think being able to create some really positive incentives for university professors to be rewarded for this. And I think monetary rewards are real. And as we're looking at policy, which I know we're not talking about in this moment, like, what are those rewards that go to schools and go to faculty members for actually having strong teaching and learning environments that actually produce a product on the back end? That really is why a young person should be in school. I mean, at this point in time, students are definitely saying, I am in college for a job after college. There's like no gray area in that, I would say, unless you're from a very wealthy family. I think even your middle income families and your upper middle income families are looking at the college debt load and saying, is it worth it? And if it is, it's because, sorry, I lost my camera there for a second. And if it is, because I'm all excited, if it is because there is a job on the back end that is going to be worth paying down the debt, et cetera.
You know, Rick, I think there's reason that substantial change is happening and is possible. So let's take the student pressure. When everything was stripped out of the higher ed experience, other than your online course, you saw families at all types of institutions start to question the value of the experience. The anecdotes of taking gap years because what are we doing here? So that is, I think, a pretty interesting form of consumer or parent-student pressure. But let's also be honest, institutions are largely now private firms dependent on tuition revenue more and more and more in the public sector, certainly in the private schools. And our ability to empirically connect better teaching with better completion, with better retention, speaks to not just the educational mission, but a president's financial interest in revenue generation and financial sustainability.
But why is this even a hard sell? I mean, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you,
it's for kids. Why is that a hard sell?
Well, we're 200 institutions in. We're working with major systems, including Texas A&M, Cal State, CUNY. They're making quality teaching and investment in faculty signature issues, because they see the value and they know the importance. So I think there's more optimism at this moment for more durable change than some of the past instances that Jonathan chronicled.
But, you know, so I mean, one thing, you guys, I mean, 200 institutions is amazing, you know, 15,000 faculty, but as you noted, it's about 1% of the nation's faculty. Why is it that this is just so that this is an effort that's beginning so far on the outskirts? I mean, when you talk to these folks, if these big systems get it, they appreciate the importance of this, why is it so alien to the way our higher education system goes about serving students?
Well, look, I think that's the long history of what has been valued. And when we sit down with a partner, we say, let's talk about the incentives that you can bring to bear to make this important on campus, important with your faculty. What will motivate investment of time and energy? Is it stipends? Is it release time? Is it recognitions? Is it awards, such that the culture and the circumstances change? But Rick, well, you also know we've
been effective on that.
Sorry?
What are a couple of the examples that you guys have seen that you're like, wow, that's making a difference on this front?
Sure. So we've studied dozens of institutional, personal, and programmatic variables as to what's correlated with high rates of earning your credential. And sure, the financial incentives matter. What matters more are the cultural drivers. Does leadership, do department chairs say this is important to who you are, to what you're doing, to our promotion, to our tenure? If you're an adjunct, let's not forget, 2/3 of the workforce is contingent. What are we considering on rehiring and what have you? All those factors are in the enterprise's control to set those conditions. So those are the things we talk about. You know, we've got this great scalable approach. We've got data, teaching works, but it's in your control. So let's work together to bring faculty into this movement. And let's also not forget, there is a two-dimensional bias out there as to what faculty will react to, right? It's the bearded with a bank of books behind you and a wool sweater versus the hundreds of thousands of faculty who are hungry to develop the techniques to do their job better. And they're eager to respond and to do that work, especially if their institutions say, this is important to us.
So, John, you know, Pamela sent a question, which I think gets exactly to where Jonathan just took us, which she asked, it seems like incentives for professors still reward publications. Which is, I think, generally true, right? As you've talked about, as your book documents, this is how we have judged worth and success in the profession. But it seems that a lot of these institutions that particularly think of themselves as portals of opportunity, the kinds of places Aimée is working with, that think of themselves, that brag about themselves as teaching institutions, it would seem that they could and should rethink the primacy of research and publication. Are they? And if they haven't over time, why not?
Well, I think Jonathan can speak more to the present day. I think the historical pattern is pretty clear. It has to do with this thing Jonathan was calling culture and the way that it's taught in graduate school, which hasn't come up yet in our discussions. So, you know, Jonathan works with institutions after they've hired people to try in a way to re-socialize them. But Rick, that's your heavy lift, right? Your heavy lift is that these people have come through a system which teaches them that the route to glory is what you write. And they've had between 8 and 12 years of that before they arrive at their first job. Another story I tell in the book is in the 50s, when all this complaining about these new mass classes, places like Harvard started to have these seminars for grad students about how to teach. Instantly, they were non-credit, which tells you something. And at one of them, this guy is very well-known biologist. He gets up there and he says, okay, listen, students, the first thing you have to know is the only thing that's going to determine your career course is your research. So he says that at a teaching seminar. And then he says, but while you're here, you should get some experience. And he tells the following story. He says, when he was in the Army, there was an Army doc who was treating a soldier who the doc thought had an appendicitis. But the doc had never removed an appendix. So he went and captured a dog, wherever this was, in Guam or wherever, and he removed its appendix as a way of practicing the procedure. And then he went ahead and treated the soldier, took out its appendix. And so the professor says to these Harvard grad students, well, you should look at the undergrads like a dog, okay, that you can practice on for a little bit. So you can say that you taught at Harvard. But that's as far as it went. And I know that some grad schools have tried to change that, but I think it's very slow going. And I do think that's the fundamental educational problem.
Me, Bob points out that we make claims about teaching without evidence as to what students are learning in higher ed. One of the things obviously that you're wrestling with is how do you help these institutions, these faculty design new courses? And as Jonathan noted, telling somebody that what they're doing isn't working feels very personal. It feels like you're saying you're not an effective. So how do you guys go about trying to get evidence? How do you go about coaching these folks? How do you go about trying to convince them that they can work on building these new courses without calling their own efficacy into question?
Yeah, so again, I think some of it is just the mindset of the folks who we are working with. They actually teach other courses. Braven is just one of the courses that they're teaching. There are other courses that they're teaching.
And
but
these are
to the
full-time
point
faculty
made,
at the institutions.
they are. And often they are associate deans who also are teaching, which I've always found interesting as well. And again, like our first partner in San Jose State, the associate dean who brought us under her wing as one of her courses is the dean of science. She also was overseeing computer science. So not just biology, but also computer science. And she was offended, as she should have been, that her students were not getting the same high quality job in the Silicon Valley labor market that has been alive and well for a long time now, as a student coming out of Stanford. And so she really wanted to figure that out. But also what happened over time is, to Jonathan's point, 95% of those students who participate in the Braven experience are persisting through school. So all of a sudden she and her other dean friends and faculty members were like, oh, this is actually a happy byproduct of a student success strategy, but it's actually completely on the academic side. So we have definitely heard from some schools who we will partner with in the future that maybe Braven should be a non-academic course. And I'm always like, well, why? Like, what? Then you're not serious about it. Then you are not serious about teaching and learning, and you're, in our opinions, not serious about making sure that your students truly do have a pathway out of here into a strong job. And so what we've seen is that there are some faculty members who know that it's time to evolve how things are being done. And then when the pandemic hit, we're on 4 different university campuses. One of the things that we heard from students, and one of the things that our partners on campuses were also remarking about, was how the Braven course continued to go. 80% of it is actually online. 20% was in person in classrooms and in these little small cohorts of 6 to 8. But we were able to get onto Zoom fast, et cetera. And we really then had our faculty friends and our associate dean friends saying, hey, can you actually help us think about how we might do this for some of our other courses as well? But that's what we've seen on our end, is that people actually are open if there's a solution that they can truly be a part of, and that doesn't make them seem like they're a failure of some sort. And I know that's how I felt as a teacher, is that as things change, or there's some curriculum or some content that you can learn and you can do better for students, if you can see yourself as a part of the solution, and you're being presented with it in a way that's going to make you feel like you can do it and you're going to be a star too, then usually you'll get behind it. But I think if it's forced in a way that makes you feel bad about yourself and about what your discipline is and what you've been working so hard at, then you're not going to want to engage.
Yeah.
Is there a specific? Right.
Well, look, this is a feel-good opportunity. And one of my favorite stories is a group of faculty we worked with who said to us, we used to get together as before we earned our credential as a faculty learning community to talk about teaching. But now that we actually have a common language, a common set of techniques and approach to talk about how to personalize, how to bring to life in my context, with my history, with my prior knowledge. Now that we have that, we realize that faculty learning community, we weren't talking about teaching, we were complaining about our students. And so it is not attention to the personalization to get a foundation of technique. And I'd actually argue, we talk about students feeling an imposter syndrome. Geez, am I college material? I suspect there's some imposter syndrome among faculty. You say, I'm going to go in, I'm going to talk for 50 minutes, you're going to pretend I'm teaching, I'm going to pretend you're learning, as opposed to the breakthrough. Wow, now we're actually teaching and learning. That's a positive. And that shows in all of our data of a very positive faculty response.
So are there data on learning outcomes or on teaching that either of you have been collecting, have found particularly useful in helping these faculty or institutions to really wrestle with this?
Yeah, I'll give a short answer. It's been key to demonstrating the value of teaching and the value of AQ's work. Now, we know higher ed has a weak data ecosystem, especially compared to K-12. So we're working with the data that institutions have, like grades, like completion rates, like re-enrollment matriculation. But even with those data, we're able to run controlled comparison studies showing effects of these practices, evidence-based teaching, on stronger achievement overall and closed equity gaps. Would we like better indicators of learning? Absolutely, and we can run those in the studies as well.
Michael writes in that, who's a faculty member, I'm not sure where, says, look, there's been a lot of pushback from faculty against teacher evaluations, which we're all familiar with. How should we think about teacher evaluations? Are they part of the solution here, or are they a distraction from real improvements in instruction?
It's a big theme in my book, the history of these things and the way that students demanded them, and then universities basically incorporated them or co-opted them, some people said. And I think it's important that we frame student evaluations as something that's necessary but not sufficient. I think we should take student evaluations really seriously, because I think there's some very important data they can show us that nothing else can. So things that are so simple, you may not think about them. Does the professor return work in a timely way? Turns out that that's hugely important to people's learning, and the students are very good monitors of it. Does the professor make herself or himself available outside of class? Also very important. And this is something really only the students can tell you. But is the teacher an effective teacher? Has the teacher enhanced your learning? It turns out that student evaluations are not a great measure of that, which is why we need others, right? It's really why we need real peer review and real analysis by fellow experts of the same kind that my book got when I submitted it to a publisher, right? We didn't have students read my manuscript and decide if it was worth publishing, right? We had fellow experts do that. And of course, we should do that with teaching as well. So this is not to diss student evaluations, because I do think they're important, but we can't rest everything on them.
Jonathan, I think you have a slightly different take on the evaluation question.
I think it's premature, right? The enterprise has not invested in a foundation of quality practice writ large. To jump to evaluation, John, it's like the opening premise of your book. We're evaluating, we don't even know what the baseline is. So let's get a foundational baseline. Let's also invest in an expert peer process. So as a faculty member, I consider it a formative process. I have confidence that my peers know what they're looking at and are giving me the feedback that's going to help me grow. And for that reason, all of our data at the moment are anonymized at the program level, at the institutional level, so we can keep this focused on the value of the work and not invite the politics around individual evaluation.
Right, and there is another problem with student evaluations. It turns out that the best predictor of whether a professor or whether a student gives a professor a strong evaluation is the grade that that student expects to receive. And there are a lot of different reasons for grade inflation, which is, by the way, the most intense at the elite schools like I teach at. But this is clearly one of the drivers. There's no question about it.
Aimée, Kevin has just chimed in with a question about another angle on this, which is, what are the best indicators that teaching is effective? So when you're working at classes and working with faculty, what are you looking at?
So I think Braven at the moment is somewhere in the middle here, because I would say we actually do after every single week of the course. So after a student goes through their experience, they are giving feedback right away that everyone gets to see on how it's going, which is just a great way as a teacher to actually then adjust your practice or for us to adjust something in the course. And so the thing that I've really realized is that you can have not necessarily formal evaluations, but there's a way in which there's a feedback loop that happens that's really in the benefit of the student. The other thing that has happened is that San Jose State won 3 awards for innovation because of the Braven course and then the experience that comes after. And those faculty members and our deans accepted those awards because they're awards. And it's like the Nobel Prize remark that I made earlier. It just, I mean, like their chests were just so popped out as they should have been. And they started to say, this is just such fun work for me to work on, to see actually how my practice in this course is actually helping students and it's being recognized. So I would just say there's a way to have like a happy medium for right now until we get to a better place, whether that's a formal evaluation, not formal evaluation. But I really do hope that we take seriously, how do you recognize people? And I saw a question earlier about the K-12 system. I just don't think we have recognized teachers at the level that we should for the very critical work that they do.
Hey, John, Benjamin, just to chip in with a great question for you. The old saying goes that 120th Street in New York City, dividing Columbia University from Teachers College, is the widest street in the city. To what extent have you found that colleges consult with schools or departments of education as they think about this instruction? And John and Aimée, I'm very much curious kind of what you have found along the way on this.
The answer in my experience, and indeed in my book, is very little. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, it's precisely the low status of the ed school that's been a great inhibitor on change here. That's not the fault of the ed school. It's that educational improvement is associated with the ed school and is therefore low status. You also find that when ed schools try to involve themselves in this issue and say, look, we could help you improve your teaching, like Mr. Philosopher, Mr. Historian, you get feedback that goes like this. I get a lot of students coming in who are going to be K through 12 teachers, and it seems to me like they're getting really bad preparation for what they do. Again, I'm not saying this is always a valid critique, but I'm saying you'll hear it. And now that you've messed up K through 12 preparation, now you want to visit it on college teaching? No, thank you. Yeah.
Jonathan?
Yeah. The majority of our work is with colleges of arts and sciences, with other professional programs. Frankly, those are where the majority of students are in their first year gateway courses for whom great teaching is going to make a difference in their lives. So we'd rather be working with those faculty and students than ed school graduate programs.
Sure.
The good news is, Rick, higher ed has its own research literature on teaching and learning. So the fear of turning the high schoolishness of this into K-12, we look and should look to a deep literature that is higher ed's own about its practice to avoid that pushback.
But is there a degree to which either the low prestige of ed schools or the prestige of K-12 teachers makes this work harder for you guys, Aimée or Jonathan?
Yeah, I would definitely say that there has been, I've even heard it from some of our campuses, some fear of the K-12 education reforms, educational equity work, however you view it, and the focus on teachers and the teacher evaluations or the teacher efficacy, et cetera, like going up into the world of higher ed, people are like, yeah, I don't want that. And so unfortunately, I think it's a little bit of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so unfortunately, I do think that's one thing that at least we've heard in the world of Braven and some of the professors and associate deans who we work with.
And look, Rick,
well, this is an hour that has flown by. So I just want to give you guys each one last thought. If for listeners out there, if there is one thing that they should be thinking about when it comes to wanting the quality of teaching at our colleges and universities to get better, what's one thought you would leave folks with? John?
Oh, the historian has to go first. We usually go last. I would say in some ways it cuts back to Aimé's comments about the liberal arts and jobs. She said from now on, everything is going to be justified or will have to be justified in vocational terms. And it turns out that a good English degree has huge vocational value. A lot of us in the humanities have gotten this wrong. And a lot of them has sort of bought this rhetoric about how the STEM and the business fields are the way into employment. But when you actually interview employers, you find out that actually they prefer somebody with a good, again, accenting good, liberal arts degree very often over somebody with a business degree, because they think that a good liberal arts degree is more likely to actually promote the kinds of skills that they want in the workplace, written and verbal analysis and synthesis and expression and all that stuff. And so there's a lot riding on this. In order to make it good, we've got to teach it better.
That's right. I'll go quickly. Thank you so much for having me. I will go back to I do, we do, you do. That is like the simplest way of knowing whether or not you are educating someone.
That's great. And Jonathan?
Let's get quality as firmly on the higher ed agenda as access and affordability, and we can do it in a way that is not threatening, and quality is the path to impact, it's the path to equity, it's the path to having integrity in what we do every day.
And the only thing I would add to that is whenever somebody says the word access, the next question should be access to what, right? Access is like rainbows and puppies. Who's against access? But what are you getting? What are you getting access to? That should be the question.
This is, and AEI likes it when we get to be on the side of rainbows and puppies. So, hey, thank you guys for a terrific session. For those of you who've been with us, if you want to learn more about the work that Aimée and Jonathan are up to, again, check out Braven or check out the Association of College and University Educators. John's new book, now available, Amateur Hour. I think you'll find it well worth your time. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great one.
Thank you, Rick.